Removing aid and taxing trade. On July the 15th, US President Donald Trump announced plans to impose over 10% tariffs on smaller countries, including many in Africa and the Caribbean. We'll probably set one tariff for all of them, President Trump said, adding that it could be a little over 10% on goods from at least 100 nations. In sharp contrast, just days ago, China reiterated it will expand zero-tariff treatment to all African countries that have diplomatic ties with China. That's on top of the list of 43 least developed countries which already enjoy this policy with China. So what can we learn from the two very different approaches towards trade with African countries, and what impact can we expect from China's zero-tariff policy for African countries? Welcome to a special edition of The Point with me, Li Xin, coming to you from Beijing. I'm pleased to be joined from Jinhua, East China's Zhejiang province, by Professor Zhang Qiaowen, Vice Dean of the Institute of African Studies at Zhejiang Normal University. From Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, by Paul Frimpong, founder and executive director of the Africa-China Center for Policy and Advisory. From London, by Hannah Ryder, a Kenyan economist and CEO of Development Reimagined. The warmest welcome to all of you. It's always a pleasure to have guests to talk about Africa-related subjects. Let's talk about the policy. So, Professor Zhang, I'm going to you first. China already announced in December last year that it was going to grant zero-tariff access to what's known as least developed countries, and it did. Okay, so 43 countries in total. That means 8 in Asia, such as Laos, Afghanistan, Cambodia, 2 in Oceania, including Kiribati and the Solomon Islands, and 33 in Africa, including Ethiopia, Eritrea, Sudan, Mozambique, Zambia, Angola, you name it. And now China announced once again, that it will very soon start to implement zero-tariff trade policy with all African countries which have diplomatic relations with China. That means 53 in total, almost all the countries in the African continent. Professor Zhang, what does that mean exactly? Help us understand.
The tariff policies first means like China will eliminate the tariff on 100% of tariff lines for all African countries with the diplomatic relation with China. But actually, China's initial commitment on zero tariff policy was at 2003 for CAC in Addis Ababa, where China first announced the zero tariff treatment to some commodities from some Africa least developed countries. At that time, is some commodity and some African countries. But the scope progressively expanded with the 2024 CAC Beijing Summit. Announced the tariff eliminations for all products from 33 least developed countries. So it's all products, but not for all African countries. Well, in June, at the China-Africa Economic and Trade Expo, China extended zero tariff coverage to all 53 African countries with the diplomatic relation with China. So at that time, is all products and all countries. So from my perspective, I think the zero tariff policies represents a natural evolution of China's long-standing commitment to China-Africa trade cooperation and development. I think this is particularly significant against the current backdrop of the recent protectionisms, including some Western's onshoring, nearshoring, and friendshoring policy. So for both Africa and China, I think their tariff policies creates a more coherent and inclusive economic partnership, and also enhance the China and Africa's trade resilience and also securities.
Mr. Frimpong, China says it will unilaterally and voluntarily open up to African goods and African countries. What do you understand is on the mind of Chinese policymakers when they are making this policy? Why do China want to do that?
Yes, obviously, as we've seen in recent times, that there's a growing economic ties between Africa and China. Obviously, at the back of the various platforms that exist that brings about a sort of engagement between Africa and China, where policymakers, government from Africa interact with Chinese counterpart. Obviously, we've seen that year in and year out, there are some new measures to improve on the relations that exist between Africa and China. Of course, in some instances, some of these improvements come from the African side. In some instances, of course, we get it from the Chinese side. But in all, I believe it's in line with the idea, and of course, with the notion that we want to grow together, we want to build together, we want to develop together. So, if China, after assessing the initial phase of this tariff-free access, where, as you narrated earlier, 33 countries from Africa were part of it. And if they've assessed this first phase and according to their own policy in the nation, they believe that expanding this from 33 to include 20 more to make 53, if they believe can enhance the economic ties and relation between Africa and China, I believe it's the best thing to do. And obviously giving African countries the opportunity to also come to the table even more and, of course, negotiate on how to meet some of the standard requirements to be able to take opportunity for this opening up. I believe that it's significant in three ways for me. One, for Africa, of course, the tariff-free elimination, which means that now you can export almost everything to China without paying anything on it. Secondly, it's access to market for Africa. And that's the significance of this, is to have access to the Chinese market. We are talking about the world's second largest economy, about over 1.4 billion consumers, very significant. Again, the announcement brings about another feature, which is that it's now the preferential access is not to limited LDCs, but now to all 53 countries that have diplomatic ties with China. So for me, these are some of the features that I believe are significant to the announcement by Chinese President Xi Jinping.
Hannah, let me go to you. How do you look at the significance of this development? Literally, does the new policy mean an exporter in Africa, in almost any country in Africa who is producing some sort of export-related goods, can now look into the Chinese market for potential opportunities at a lower cost? And is China seeking a reciprocity for what it's doing, which means for that seeking zero tariff in return? Is China doing that?
Yes. So let's just go a little bit historically as well, and just building on what Zhang Laoshi and Paul have said. Until now, China followed the precedent in the World Trade Organization for having this kind of policy with regards to least developed countries. So the EU has something called the Everything But Arms Agreement, and also India and Brazil all voluntarily, like China, all voluntarily had these schemes for least developed countries. That was when China joined the WTO in 2001, and therefore 2003, just 2 years later, started this policy. But what has happened over time is, of course, preferential trade agreements are very important for least developed countries. And what we also had in 2000 also was another kind of policy which was brought in by the US and the WTO called the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act from the US, which was selective African countries. And what we found, what happened with the least developed country policy is that although it's been helpful for African countries, we've also had in 2021 the introduction of the African Continental Free Trade Area. And the aim of that is to really unite the African continent in terms of our trade policy. So harmonizing all of the tariffs, eliminating the tariffs across borders, but also then harmonizing our external policies. And the challenge with that is when you have the least developed countries' policies, then the countries where you even have the largest manufacturing capability and the best export capability, they don't get the benefits of those preferential agreements. If you're following the EU example. If you're following the US example, then it's really selective. But then why be selective when you have a continental free trade policy? So these were the options for China. Do you stick with the status quo that's established in the WTO? Do you go with this selective approach, or do you try something completely new? And since 2021, there has been a push from the African side to have the African Continental Free Trade Area really acknowledged by trade partners. And this is the first time that a trade partner has acknowledged the African Continental Free Trade Area and its ambitions. So I think it's very important to recognize just how unprecedented it is, and just how important it is also for the way that Africa trades, because LDCs do have trade. We have significant trade with China, but it's less than half of our overall trade with China. So if we're going to be increasing exports, fundamentally, at least at first, for the first, 20, 40 years, the strongest exports, especially in terms of manufacturing and value addition, which is what African countries want, is going to be coming from the richer countries. And so this is why that preferential trade agreement is so important to extend to all African countries.
Nevertheless, China is the first major economy, and itself being a major developing country, to make such a significant move to recognize basically the whole African continent as one trading partner where, trade can flow and there's great integration of supply chain. Why has China decided to take this significant step ahead of, the European Union, for instance, ahead of North America?
Well, I think it's being responsive to African demands. Obviously, there is a strong geopolitical win at this point. We know what else is happening in the rest of the world in terms of tariffs. But at the same time, this is something that African countries have been pushing since 2021, at least. From when the African Continental Free Trade Area began, we were hosting discussions in China with the African Union in partnership to really try to encourage this recognition. And we were doing that also with other partners. But at the same time, here China is responsive. We have this Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. It's consistent. The yearly meetings, there's every 3 years, there's the large summit. And this is where, the real understanding of African policy comes from, and the openness to African policy. So I think we have to congratulate China, obviously, for putting this forward, but we also have to really account for the push from the African side to be really trying to get this kind of policy in place.
Professor Zhang, let me go back to you. What is it for China? Foreign China is not demanding reciprocity here. It's a unilateral and voluntary opening up. I keep stressing these terms. What does China see as benefit or gain, or that is something that's right for China to do? How does China make such a policy?
So I also just want to say some things about, like Hannah mentioned, is agro. It's called the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. This is introduced by the US. And so the AGOA, we call it agro, has provided some African country with a duty-free access to the US market. I think this is a good side, or this is a positive side. But the program also systematically exclude countries based on the political consideration. So several African nations has been removed from agro over the years due to the governance concerns, due to the trade dispute, or failing to meet the specific democratic and economic criteria. So this creates uncertainties for the African business and investors. So I also want to say something about the reciprocal tariff. The US government announced tariff region from 10% to 50% on a group of Africa trading partners. When I see this 50% imposed to the Lesotho, I'm very surprised. So the US tariff policies, I think, is effectively canceled out the tariff preference that African countries they enjoyed under the agro. So we say that US using the tariff barriers to disrupt global production chains, supply chains, and the trade patterns involving the Africa participations. So that's why China, the policy, I think they offer the unconditional market access across all products categories. So this approach reflects a long-term partnership strategy that does not impose the political conditions for the performance requirement on African nations. So I think this is not only for Africa, for China, it's also provide a trading partner and also secure the trade resilience. So I think for these policies is provide a stable market access that allow African business to plan long-term investigations and supply chain relationships. But at the same time, I think for China, currently we are doing the industrializations. Africa definitely is a big market for us. So I think this policy is not a benefit for Africa, but also for China.
In terms of prospects, half a year after China implemented zero-tariff policy for the least developed countries, trade of those countries in Africa with China actually jumped by 15% year on year. Professor Zhang, let me stay with you for one more question. How do you look at the prospect of trade between China and African countries with the zero-tariff policy in place?
I think for the zero-tariff policy, and the first is because China is a very large market. Okay, so I think that zero-tariff policy definitely provide a huge market for the Africa and for the Africa products. But one of the things I want to say is China itself also has a very strong manufacturing capabilities. So I think besides the policy incentives, and African countries needed to be strategic about expanding exports to China. So what I want to say first is China's expanding the middle class. Now currently we have over 400 million people. It creates a numerous demand for diverse consumer goods. But this seeks premium and the specialty products that Africa can supply. So beyond traditional exports, like a mineral, like raw materials, African countries can tap into Chinese consumers' demand for organic foods, specialty coffees, or the unique textile. This is the first things I want to say. Then another is I think China's advanced digital commerce infrastructures also provide African business with a new pathway to reach the Chinese consumer. The platform like Tumia, like Shein, and the emerging the live streaming commerce channels also allow Africa companies to sell directly to Chinese consumer without the traditional intermediaries.
Professor Zhang Qiaowen, Vice Dean of the Institute of African Studies at Zhejiang Normal University. Thank you so much. Let me go back to Paul and Hannah. A lot, really, of what Professor Zhang talked about. But Paul, let me go to you first. As I said, according to Chinese numbers from December last year to March this year, China's imports from the 33 least developed countries in Africa reached $20 billion US. That's a 15% year-on-year increase since the policy took effect. How have African countries taken advantage of this policy, and how do you look at the prospects going further?
Yeah, I think the prospect is very positive. Obviously, this policy gives access to the key point that I already raised earlier, that this is to strengthen the sort of economic cooperation between Africa and China. Obviously, China has been Africa's largest trading partner for almost a decade now, almost 2 decades now. Where last year trade volume reached about $290 billion, which is also a record high. And so obviously this goes to the point that it's part of the broader engagement between Africa and China that wants to engage more, inclusion, market access, development oriented in nature. And this goes to also speak to the point which has always been at the center of Africa-China relations, where it's about building a system where we can create a common market for everyone. So I believe it is very key, and the prospect is very high. Obviously, in the context of Africa, the prospect is also to ensure that we can even diversify our exports, which has been one of our key ambitions. We look at some continental prints like the Agenda 2063, some national development policy plans about trade. It's about adding value to the things that we export. And this gives us an opportunity because like Ghana can add, can process cocoa and ship it to China, duty-free. We talk about cashew nuts. Some countries are already doing same. So obviously, this is an opportunity for export diversification. That prospect is going to come to life with this new policy that we have. There's also help us in competitiveness in terms of the set of African goods and product that gets to the Chinese market. Because as previously, if, for example, Ghana, which was not part of this policy, as you export goods to the Chinese market under tariff, of course, you're going to be, your goods in the Chinese market is going to go up at a certain price. Now, with this new policy, and now you can export to China duty-free, it means that your cost of doing business in China will come down, and therefore your product in the Chinese market is going to be competitive compared to product from other regions into the China. So I believe that these are the prospects that it brings to Africa-China trade.
Actually, there are some numbers of China's imports of agricultural goods from Africa during the first 5 months of this year. It's $2 billion US. The absolute number is not that big, but if you look at the growth rate of, for instance, coffee, cocoa beans, and frozen strawberries, it jumped by 140%. 90% and 80% respectively, so considerable growth. Hannah, let me go to you here. Where should a potential exporter to China look to at this moment? Where can they find and do the calculation? How much can they calculate as reduction of cost, and what more do they have to do in order to really access the Chinese markets?
Well, as we've said, the good news is now that there is duty-free. The tariffs are not going to be there, so that brings down the cost, certainly, of exporting, but it doesn't solve everything. Exporting to China, you need to have channels. You need to have the agents who will also help you and get onto the e-commerce platforms that we were talking about.
Right.
You need to be able to deal with the language barriers of selling your products in China. My firm works with a lot of African fashion and jewelry brands, also food and beverage brands, to sell their products in China. And it's not easy. You need to also understand the Chinese consumer, not necessarily like the European or American.
What do the Chinese consumers like? Tell us one tip. What would sell?
What would sell? Well, a great deal. The thing is, what's very interesting about the Chinese market is it's very diverse. And I think this is one of the great, one of the aspects of the Chinese market that is very positive for African countries. It is smaller at the moment than the US market. The US retail market is estimated around $19 billion US. China is $7 billion. But within 4.5 years, we're expecting the Chinese retail market to surpass the US. So there is, in addition to the diversity in China, I think there's a great deal of opportunity for African exporters. And I think the opportunity especially lies in the manufacturing and value-added goods. You've talked a bit about the agricultural products,
right.
And of course, kind of an absolute basis for many African countries. We depend on agriculture, and what we're trying to do is to up each stage of processing as we export. So if you're talking about coffee, we don't want to be exporting the raw beans. We want to be exporting branded products, already roasted, etc. But we have to work on the infrastructure for that, and so it will take time. It will definitely. But the point is, the incentives are in the right direction. This is the point of the policy, and it helps in terms of African confidence. Professor Zhang was talking about certainty. The certainty is established. We have that opening, and so we can put money into it and we can invest in it. We can persuade our African banks to support more exporters to China.
Well, one thing about Chinese policy is that it doesn't change from day to day. I mean, it probably takes a longer time to warm up, to take shape, but once it is there, you can expect that it's going to be there for some time. Paul, let me go back to you. Just now we touched a little bit about the raw material, and indeed raw material and minerals make up the bulk of China's imports from Africa, 68% from the latest number that we can find. But on the other hand, imports from Africa have also been growing, and are there changes in those regard, the structure of imports from Africa? I just now talked about agricultural goods. Hannah talked a bit about, the manufacturing and other goods, not just raw material, not just unprocessed coffee beans, but things with more added value. Do you see those sectors taking a good advantage of the policy that's going to be implemented?
Absolutely. As we are monitoring and tracking even the first half of this year in terms of the imports mix import back from China into Africa, you can see there's a lot of imports from China in the industrial equipment and machinery, and of course in electronics as well. And that shows that obviously the Africa is trying to ramp up this advantage. Obviously, inspired by the fact that now we have the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, countries are now emboldened to diversify their exports, which is all about adding value to our raw material before we export. And for that matter, as we are seeing in this first half of the year, there's a lot of import of Chinese industrial and equipment into African countries, which is not typical of the usually goods that are being imported into Africa from China. So obviously that is a key differentiator when it comes to the import that we've seen coming from China to Africa in the first half of this year.
Well, you talk about it, that from January to May, China's exporting value to Africa through foreign contracted projects reached 1.8 billion US dollars, up 46% year on year. That's also according to Chinese customs numbers. Help us understand a bit about China's exports to Africa. Why such huge jump, and why is it in such a form? It's through foreign contracted projects. Is that what the continents are looking for?
Yeah, obviously, I mean, as we've seen, Africa and China has been engaging, of course, improving on the level of engagement that is happening between the two regions. And now, of course, China becomes a very obvious partner for Africa. We look at what is happening around the world today. While China presents opportunity, other regions present obstacles. And so if countries want to industrialize, if a country wants to develop, obviously they need to look for a partner that is development oriented in nature, a partner that is open and inclusive in nature, a partner that supports the vision that the continent has. So obviously, if China presents that, then we can see a jump in terms of the engagement between China and African countries in this respect.
One last question, really quick, Paul, and then Hannah. One sentence, literally. What would you say to a potential African business person or a producer at this moment? Where should they go? What should they keep in mind?
To African producers, obviously, we are encouraging to look for a market that brings opportunity. And as we've discussed here, obviously, this tariff-free access to all 53 African countries is that kind of opportunity that we seek to promote for African producers. So obviously, we encourage to take advantage, go through the right channel, and of course, get to be competitive in the Chinese market to grow our respective economies.
Hannah?
I'd say it's a game changer. Look at China. Engage, bring your products to China. Simple as that.
Okay, well, certainly we are looking for good quality and affordable products, imports from around the world, but it is a very competitive market, and we, in terms of taste, we are quite selective, I would also say. So welcome, but it's not going to be an easy journey, but welcome definitely. And many thanks to my guest, Paul Frimpong, founder and executive director of the Africa-China Center for Policy and Advisory, and from London, Hannah Ryder, Kenyan economist and CEO of Development Reimagined. Thank you so much for your valuable insights.